What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller from Hook'emHeadlines.com coming back at y'all today with another transfer breakdown. We got our first one in the last couple of months here. I think the last time I did one was A.D. Mitchell, but we're recording this video on the night of April 17th. Earlier this afternoon, Texas landed a commitment from the fourth-year graduate transfer, senior defensive lineman Trill Carter from Minnesota. Carter is a 6'2" and 310-pound reigning All Big Ten honorable mention defensive lineman. Took plenty of reps at Minnesota here in the last few years. I believe it was nearly 500 defensive snaps last season, around 1,200 total defensive snaps under his belt in his collegiate career thus far. He has 2 years of eligibility remaining thanks to the 4-game redshirt rule and then the COVID redshirt rule. So actually could help bolster the depth for Texas along the defensive line for the next 2 years. I think this is a solid get for Texas. It reminds me a lot of the Diamante Tucker Dorsey edition out of the portal last spring. Texas got a really solid, rotational starting caliber linebacker, or well, both. He, filled starting need or filled a starting position when needed, and otherwise was a rotational guy that helped shore up depth along. And so, I think that Trill Carter is a really solid get. He really kind of solidifies like a top group of 4 or 5 defensive linemen along the interior for Texas. Texas has that top group of Devondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, and Alfred Collins. But behind those three, Vernon Broughton has some reps under his belt the last few seasons, but he's not a solidified run defender. He's a more adept as a pass rusher. And, Carter gives them a very, very proven run stopper out of the 3-tech. But like I said, it's been a while since I had done one of these videos and kind of recap the format that I do for these. I'll talk about some of the background and what Carter was able to do during his 4 years at Minnesota. What his game looks like, and then how he fits at Texas. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump in here. First off, I want to mention that I think again I think this is a very solid get for Texas. Trill Carter is a guy that, the box score stats might not jump off the page at you, but, he was very reliable and consistent, especially in run defense for Minnesota. He was a pretty under-recruited 3-star kid out of Leesburg, Georgia. Didn't have a ton of offers coming out of high school. I believe he had like Arkansas, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, schools like that. Ultimately ended up committing to head coach PJ Fleck in Minnesota to help row the boat up with the Golden Gophers. For Carter, you really didn't see much out of him during his true freshman campaign. He ended up playing just 2 defensive snaps in 2019. But you started to see an uptick in his reps. He became a more integral part of Minnesota's defensive line rotation during his sophomore campaign. Ended up getting nearly 250 defensive snaps that season. In the process, he was actually pretty productive and made some plays. 16 combined tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Actually had an interception as well, 1 batted ball. And then I believe about a half dozen quarterback pressures. 8 defensive stops, only 2 missed tackles. So, again, he was pretty consistent, didn't make many mistakes, held his gaps well. Those would be consistent themes for him, over the course of his entire career in Minnesota. In 2021, Carter started to become more of a full-time starter. He didn't get full-time starter reps all the way throughout, but still nearly 400 defensive snaps, which I would consider a starter-type load. He did play in 10 games for the Golden Gophers, registered 20 combined tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 1 sack, and 2 batted balls. You could argue that 2021 was Carter's most consistent and well-rounded season in Minnesota. I found a lot of interesting stats on him from the 2021 campaign where he looked really good, both as a pass rusher and a run stopper. He ended up registering 17 defensive stops, I believe 15 of which were run stops, more than a dozen run stuffs as well. 5 missed tackles, around a dozen quarterback pressures. I mentioned the 1 sack, but he was getting a lot of good pressure on the quarterback. He only had 196 snaps as a pass rusher, and in true pass sets, he actually ranked among the top 5 interior defensive linemen in the Big Ten in terms of win rate. So essentially, true pass sets for those people that are unaware, it's a PFF metric that measures like plays where you have at least 4 pass rushers that the time to throw for the quarterback is over 2 seconds, and that it's essentially not a broken play, so not like an immediate throwaway or anything like that. So, on not only on passing downs, but on pretty standard passing plays, Carter is a guy that was really effective in the pass rush in 2021. In 2022, I do think he was a little bit better against the run, but he wasn't as productive in the pass rush. He ended up getting 545 defensive snaps last season, so was definitely a full-time starter. I believe he ranked among the top 4 Minnesota defenders in terms of total defensive snaps last season. 316 snaps in the pass rush, and he finished with around the same number of quarterback pressures. He had a dozen. I believe did finish up with 1.5 sacks last season, 2 tackles for loss, 19 combined tackles. The biggest difference year over year for Carter between 2021 and 2022 was the number of defensive stops. He was still playing in a similar role along Minnesota's defensive line. If you kind of look at some of the numbers there, his average depth of tackle is in run defense did move back by about a half yard. He finished up with a similar number of run stuff, just not as many tackles for loss. He was pushed back a little bit more. I think that was due to a combination of turnover along Minnesota's defensive line and just nature by way of the game. Stats aren't always going to mirror themselves year over year, but I still thought he had a pretty solid season. He was still a consistent run stopper for Minnesota out of the 3 tech. Still finished up with around 10 run stuffs, a dozen defensive stops, a dozen quarterback pressures. He was still someone that was a consistent force up front. He did miss 5 tackles last season, but I think two of them ended up coming in one game against Illinois, which was a bad game for him. But down the stretch, in the entire second half of the season, he only missed 2 tackles. In the process, ended up finishing up with more than a half dozen defensive stops and around 7 quarterback pressures. So he finished up the 2022 campaign on a high note, and I think ultimately will be a guy that can make an immediate impact on this Texas defensive line, heading into the summer and then fall camp. He's got momentum from finishing out last season on a high note. Let's go ahead and move into talking about maybe some of the finer points of Carter's game. I mentioned a lot of the stats and some of the strengths of his already, but I really want to get into a skill set and kind of mention some of the notes there that I have. I think Carter, there's a few strengths of his that really stand out in the tape that I've watched of his so far. The first one being that he plays with good pad level, and he's got really quick burst, good burst off the line of scrimmage. He's a guy that, despite his big, he's a big body in the trenches. He's that big human that, Bo Davis and Kyle Flood love to have around the line of scrimmage. And, for his size, I think he moves pretty well. He's not the most athletic guy in the world, but again, quick burst. He's pretty good as a read and react interior defensive lineman, in the sense that his play diagnosis and his just football IQ are solid. Okay. So yeah, he plays with good pad level. He uses his leverage pretty well, good hands, and quick burst off the line of scrimmage. You really notice for him in run defense that when he's able to find the football, that you're rarely going to end up getting past him. If nothing else, he's going to wind up leading a charge and helping to blow up a play in the backfield, or at least get a stop for something that would constitute a successful play for the defense. That's the sort of mantra that I think Texas wants up front. It's not always that a guy like Byron Murphy or Tavondre Sweat along the defensive line needs to be the one blowing up plays in the backfield and making a bunch of plays as a run defender. If they're able to take up space, hold their gaps, maybe take up 2 blockers at the line of scrimmage, that allows a guy like Jalen Ford or this coming fall like Anthony Hill or David Benda to clean up the play and still get a defensive stop. So from that perspective, I think that Carter's a nice fit here. Pad leverage is something that can take a few years to refine. So the fact that, he's already experienced and plays with that solid fundamental strength in his game is a major plus. A few of the other strengths that I've noticed, I've mentioned it here and there, but his ability as a read and react defensive lineman, I think, is pretty solid. I mean, over the course of his career at Minnesota, you can see, different ways that he's able to be disruptive, despite like kind of a limited athletic ceiling. He's not the longest athlete. He's only 6'2". He's not the most fleet of foot. He's not very lengthy. Wingspan's not that long. But he's still able to find a way to get, 3 batted balls, 1 interception, multiple sacks, tackles for loss, things like that, usually, I guess you usually wouldn't notice in a conference that has as many good offensive linemen along the interior as the Big Ten. And so, again, Carter's a guy that's able to find the football and find ways just to make plays. And so, that's something that Texas is going to need up front, especially to help guide along some of these more developmental or inexperienced interior defensive linemen, kind of looking at a guy like Sadir Mitchell or, even Vernon Broughton. I think Vernon Broughton could learn a lot from Trill Carter as a run defender. Broughton's still definitely developing that part of his game. And the last strength I really wanted to mention for Carter, and this does come in the pass rush. I think his specialty is in run defense, but, in the pass rush, he's still someone that, despite maybe not having the most impressive numbers on paper, can be effective. I think that, he's going to be more of like a second team interior pass rusher. I think Texas is still going to look to guys like Sweat, Collins, Murphy, even maybe Vernon Broughton. He is a good pass rusher, more so than Trill Carter. But, I think in obvious passing downs, especially when guys like Sweat or Murphy need a break, that you can put Carter in and on plays where, it's a true pass set. I mentioned that stat earlier that he was one of the top 5 best interior defensive linemen in the Big Ten in terms of win rate. That, he can still be really effective and efficient. In the last 2 seasons, he ranks among the top 10 interior defensive linemen in the Big Ten in true pass sets in terms of win rate. So put in the right situations, I think he can excel. Again, it all comes back to kind of that quick burst off the line of scrimmage. When he knows where to go and, can, diagnose the play quickly, he can make good things happen. That's kind of cliche for any experienced and proven defensive lineman, but, this is a valuable get for Texas. And so, again, like I said, valuable to have this veteran voice in the locker room and this type of presence up front, especially when you have so many other experienced interior defensive linemen that round out the top group. Collins, Sweat both being seniors, Murphy being, I think, one of the best junior defensive linemen in the Big 12. But yeah, anyway, let's go ahead and look ahead now to where I think Carter ultimately fits at Texas and kind of what his ceiling could be. I know that I've kind of dropped clues and hints all throughout the video of where I think he fits, but even sometimes just straight up said it. But I think again he's going to kind of be the 4th defensive lineman in the rotation. And I think he's probably best set at the 3 tech for Texas. That's where he played pretty much all of his snaps at Minnesota. He actually has the most. He has the most run or most defensive snaps as a run defender out of the 3 tech of any defensive lineman in the Big Ten in the last 2 seasons. So that's where most of his experience comes. I think that's where his strengths are, or where his strengths lie. And I think both as a pass rusher and as a run defender, that's where he's mostly going to play. I think second string, is going to be where he's slotted heading into the fall. He'll be able to compete with guys like Alfred Collins, like Vernon Broughton, even Sadir Mitchell. I think this defensive line rotation is going to be an open competition. I really think only Sweat and Murphy are guys that you could really say are locked in as starters. So, but I think, again, Carter's going to help provide a lot of valuable depth. Having another run defender up there is definitely not a bad thing. And he really helps to address one of the bigger like depth needs I think that Texas had on the defensive side of the ball coming out of spring camp. Realistically, I think Carter's going to be maybe like a 15, 20 tackle guy. I don't think he's going to get the same number of reps that he did at Minnesota, but I do think he comes into a better situation along the interior defensive line in the sense that, maybe where a guy next to him wouldn't be holding his gaps as well. I think playing next to guys like Byron Murphy, like Devondre Sweat, like Alfred Collins, and like Jalen Ford it's just going to make him that much better. And I think that could reflect in the stat sheet a little bit more. In Texas's interior pass rush last season was a major strength. So maybe that can lead to Carter getting, I think realistically, he's probably going to be a 1 or 2 sack guy. But, Texas led the Big 12 in quarterback pressures last season. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Carter end up with a career high in quarterback pressures. But he did get 316 snaps in the pass rush last season. I think you're probably looking at more something like 150 or 200 at Texas. But again, love this addition for the Longhorns. Getting this quality depth piece, another veteran voice in the locker room, and really shoring up the interior run defense, I think is a really good move for Bo Davis, Pete Kwiatkowski, Steve Sarkisian, the entire coaching staff. So, I'm interested to see what else Texas does in the portal this offseason, but Trill Carter is a solid first pickup. I think being able to address these positional needs after you had after you had spring camp to evaluate the roster, is the right way to go. Texas has taken a very patient approach in the portal so far this offseason. I think that's going to pay off heading into the fall. But anyway, for Andrew Miller at Hook'emHeadlines.com, that's pretty much it. Hook 'em.